Every day, you and I get bombarded with negative news. And just like our bodies becomes what we eat, our minds become the information that we consume. If you want to stay positive, it's so important that you also listen to stories that inspires you and uplifts you. In this podcast, we interview world-leading experts dedicated to solving the world's most pressing problems. And if you stick around, I promise you will not only be as informed as if you watch the news, you will feel uplifted, inspired, and have more positive energy in your life. Welcome to Great.com Talks with. Welcome. Today, Great.com talks with the Global Forest Coalition. And I'm here today with Simone Lovera, who is the founder and the director. And if you haven't heard of the Global Forest Coalition before, they are an international coalition of NGOs and indigenous people who are defending social justice and rights for forest people, which is people living in the forest. And they are just now celebrating their 20th anniversary. So I thought this would be a fun time to talk about the story of the organization, what they have been challenged by and accomplished over those 20 years. So Simone, welcome.
Thank you.
So how would you describe, I did my best now, but how would you describe your organization to someone that might not be so familiar with both your cause and the challenges that you're facing?
So Global Forest Coalition is first and foremost a coalition really of, at the moment, 112 indigenous peoples organizations, women's groups, and non-governmental organizations, environmental organizations, from at the moment 68 different countries in the world. So we're really spread out all over the world, all continents, both Europe and a lot of the southern continents. About 2/3 to 3/4 of our membership is actually based outside of Europe and the and North America. And we have a very clear mission of striving for rights-based, socially just forest policies, and also gender-responsive forest policies. So forest policies that meet the rights, needs, and aspiration of women, of indigenous peoples, and of the local communities that really live with and depend on their forest. So we particularly look at the social aspects and make sure that forest policies are coherent with human rights. At the same time, we also have a very strong focus on real solutions. We feel that there's too many small-scale ad hoc solutions being proposed, while the big drivers of forest loss are left unaddressed. So we look at, for example, meat and dairy consumption as a key driver of forest loss, or the increasing use of wood-based biomass as a key cause of forest loss.
Interesting. And I personally feel the importance of the work that you do to make sure our forests remain standing up. And I like also that you're focusing on these big problems. So what can be done to stop those big problems?
I think it's very important that fundamental change will be needed, because if only because of climate change and also biodiversity loss. These are big global crisis situations that very much impact on forest and on the people that depend on forest. And they sadly can simply not be addressed in a business as usual scenario. They need a very fundamental change in the way our economies are structured, in the way business is done. That means, for example, also a change in consumption patterns, and taking into account that a lot of consumption patterns are shaped actually by subsidies and by marketing. People just don't consume just because it's their own choice, but they're very much influenced to have that choice. There's no fair pricing of products like meat. There's far too many subsidies still going to, for example, intensive livestock farming, even though that's a major cause of deforestation. Sadly, in Europe, massive subsidies are given to wood-based biomass, even though we by now have ample scientific evidence that this is actually super bad for climate change and for forest alike. So it's the easy steps are actually taking away those things that are still subsidized with public money because we think that redirecting those subsidies will actually already cause a major change. But we are analyzing that the reason those subsidies are there is also because corporations have too much influence on government policy. Of course, that requires a much more profound change. We are afraid that, for example, as long as agro-industry has such a strong influence on government, a lot of the subsidies to agro-industry will just remain. So we need to address those underlying causes as well. On the positive side, we think that there are a lot of solutions that are very well known, because the indigenous peoples we work with and that are part of our membership, the women's groups, the community groups, often show very inspiring examples of community conservation of forests. A convention on biodiversity talks about living in harmony with nature. But if you go to the ground, you actually see in a lot of locations that local communities, especially traditional local communities and indigenous peoples, are living in harmony with their forests. We very much believe in that, in forest conservation by and for people. There's very convincing scientific evidence also that if you give people the right to govern their own forest, if you give local communities, indigenous peoples, the right to govern their own forest in a way that also takes into account women's participation in such governance structure in a way this is managed, that forest will actually be conserved and even restored. And there's extremely inspiring stories from all over the world of how this is happening. In a country like Nepal, forest cover has been expanding massively because of a huge network of community forest user groups that is just taking forest management in their own hands and has the right to access and use the forest themselves. And here again, women are very often taking the lead in these situations. So I think we can very much learn from that. I mean, it looks like, too often that radical change is impossible, but it is actually something that has already happened. We just need to avoid these kinds of initiatives being, bulldozered away by some of the big drivers of forest loss.
Right. The subsidies that are happening is very frustrating. So it's inspiring to hear people like you sharing the stories that, especially when women and indigenous people gets involved, humans go back to a sort of harmony with nature. That brings me some sense of hope in times of climate change. Now, I'm curious to hear more about the solutions that you are working on. But before that, let's rewind time a little bit and look at the story of the Global Forest Coalition. What started this idea? Tell me the
It was
story.
actually in 2000, and I must say I was there myself for one of the founding organizations, but not for GFC itself. But we came together with a whole group of organizations very much involved in forest policy, following it also very much at the international level, both indigenous peoples groups and NGOs. And we realized there was a very dangerous trend happening with some very large organizations like the World Bank developing a tropical forest plan together with some very large conservation organizations that basically divided the entire world's forest in two types of forests. One was protected areas, which were often very conventional and strict, so people could not access those forests anymore. And even nowadays, I'm afraid most of the protected areas still do not take into account enough the rights of local communities, indigenous peoples living in or around them.
So
And on the
wait,
other,
so that I understand. So if someone is living in that forest and then the World Bank turns it into a protected area, what happens with the people that already live there?
well, sadly, sometimes they're just kicked out.
Wow.
We've got terrifying cases of people being involuntarily displaced, as you call it. Even recently, there's still an ongoing conflict in Kenya where a lot of people face what you call involuntary resettlement. I think that's actually, they're being kicked out. I think we should use normal language. And also that they're just being prohibited to do simple things like gathering medicinal plants or have fuel wood for cooking, and other very basic access that doesn't have to be damaging at all. And suddenly all the rights they used to have to that forest are being denied. It is estimated there's some 500,000 conservation refugees, as you call it, in the world. And that's
Wow.
partly from forest and partly from other areas. So there is awareness about this problem, and there is a lot of willingness to change it. But sadly, I'm afraid the change is just going far too slow. And still, a lot of protected areas are being established without free, prior, and informed consent of the people who really live there. And we think it's really a missed opportunity because, on the one hand, those areas are often very badly protected. They're just not effective because, it's very hard to keep people out of the forest, in such a remote condition. You can put a couple of forest guards, but it's just very expensive also to do this with violence. But the other sad thing is that often it's people that lived in harmony with their forests. By imposing this kind of policies, you totally frustrate them. So we're actually really concerned also about, there's proposals now to put 30% of the world in a protected area. And we feel it's a missed opportunity to actually live in harmony with nature, to stimulate people to live with forest instead of just kicking them out.
And utilize the indigenous guardians of that
Yeah,
forest.
exactly. And the sad thing is then people still feel they need a lot of wood. So the proposal then was to actually basically turn the other 50% of the world's forest into logging areas, including monoculture tree plantations. So just areas where, wood could be produced in a very efficient way. And sadly, some of the official definitions of forest still basically include long rows of the same tree, which is a monoculture tree plantation, like a eucalypt plantation or a pine plantation. And you still find them all over the world. And they're an offense, actually, because they impact very negatively on the environment. Biodiversity is just not there. All the forest species that you normally would find in a forest is not there. They impact very negatively on water, and they impact very negatively on people because it's a kind of industry that provides very little jobs, only for men also. It comes with a lot of negative social impacts. And you also see that big plantation areas in this world are often very depopulated areas. So if you talk about living with harmony in nature, this is exactly the opposite. You occupy huge areas for just planting the same tree, and nobody benefits except for the timber industry and especially the bioenergy industry. And this plan was so shocking for a lot of people in 2000 that we really felt like we need to establish a coalition of those groups, those indigenous peoples organizations and NGOs and women's groups that really believe in forest conservation by and for people, that really believe in social justice in forest policy and making sure that people are allowed to care for their own forest, to live with their own forest in harmony. It's from that moment it actually has grown, and a lot of groups that very much share that vision have joined. And I must say we are less known often in the national level because we very much are a coalition of national groups that are not called like Global Forest Coalition Netherlands or something, but that have their own name. In different countries you will see us actually under different names. And then at the international level, we really try to work together to share information, to share lessons learned, to share the stories from the ground, and to also link our stories to some of the international policy processes, especially if they still try to promote this old-fashioned model of, basically trees without people.
First of all, I'm really happy in my heart that so many people all over the world are fighting to protect the world's forest. And secondly, these stories you tell me about, that interest me. Would you describe a success story that the coalition has had? What are you the most proud of looking back at 20 years history?
There's different levels. If you talk about the drivers, I do think we are one of the first groups that really emphasized that meat and dairy consumption was the elephant in the room. That if you cannot conserve the world's forest if you continue to expand meat and dairy consumption, this is a massive impact on land, and what forests really need is land. Forests don't need a lot of money actually, because if they have the land to grow on and you don't need that land for another thing, a forest is perfectly capable of growing itself. I mean, it has done so for millions of years. throughout the planet's history, forests have just conserved themselves, provided you didn't need to land for other things. And that's why livestock farming is actually a massive negative factor. I mean, in the US, it is estimated that about 3/5 of the United States, the entire United States, is being used for meat and dairy production.
Wow.
So that's just a massive loss of land. I think, yeah, one of our success stories is that we were before the large groups, and we very much welcomed by the time that the large, well-known groups, took up this agenda. But we were really, together with a couple of very small groups, we were really one of the first groups that really started pointing at this. For example, amongst climate policymakers and amongst biodiversity policymakers. And we are extremely happy. We also fed it, for example, into the IPCC report on this, which had a very strong message about the need to shift to more plant-based diets. And I think it's really a very great thing that this has come so far. But I do remember that, yeah, in 10 years ago, we were about the first group pointing at this. A little bit the same actually with food-based bioenergy. I mean, we already started pointing at this in like 2006, 2007, that this was a major problem. By that time, a lot of people still felt like, how do you mean burning wood is a problem? And by now, so many scientists, so many policymakers agree with us. And definitely almost all the big environmental groups agree that food-based bioenergy, especially if used on a large scale or industrial level, is a massive problem. So yeah, there also, I think that's for Global Forest Coalition, those have been success stories that we were like the first that really pushed that. And once again, I should emphasize we are a coalition. So this was with some of our member groups that are really forerunners in that front. On the other side, of course, I'm super proud on some of the stories of groups we help on the ground. Actually, also specifically women's groups. We have a very strong gender program nowadays, and I'm sometimes tremendously happy to come to a village and see how women have empowered themselves. These are women that haven't had the chance to go to school, that have never had the chance to develop their own income, to self-develop. And still we see that through the work we've been doing on capacity building, on pointing out to them that they have a very positive role to play in the community, especially in their relations with forests. You just see these women grow, and it's amazing what they are doing. It's amazing how women in Kenya, for example, are setting up their own cooperatives and trying to help each other, getting a little income and planting a lot of trees with it. I mean, super inspiring initiatives.
Super inspiring for sure. Wow. So we have been talking about some different ways to protect the forests and ultimately our climate. And I can imagine that someone listening to this now feels inspired that you are trying to solve these big problems before it's too late. So let's say someone is inspired and they want to help your organization. And let's say they wanted to donate $10 to you. Where would that money go? What are you currently working on?
It would go very much on to these campaigns I mentioned, so to raise the awareness of policymakers to address the real causes of forest loss and not to get stuck in very small scale conventional solutions. Small protected areas that in the end will be washed away by soy production or so. So, and it will go also indirectly, for example, to these women's capacity building initiatives that we are still organizing all over the world, really highlighting the role of women in forest conservation, but also strengthening that role and strengthening their work on the ground. It will go on showcasing. We're trying not to fund small projects themselves, but rather showcase them to some of the bigger donors so that they can step in and really upscale them. So we are very much helping policy work so that governments start providing much more support to this kind of community, gender responsive community conservation work. So in that respect, we also do a lot of work around, showcasing this to policymakers and look, these are the positive things that you need to support. And that doesn't only have to be by money. Very often it's a matter of recognizing, for example, the rights of indigenous peoples or local communities of women to conserve their own forests. I think that's a very key advocacy strategy for us.
Right. So if you feel inspired by this, what else can someone do to stay in contact with you?
So we have a website, globalforestcoalition.org. I think you can very easily connect to that. There's several options there to stay in touch with us, so we can send you regular information. You can also provide a direct donation. If you're curious to see what the national member is of Global Forest Coalition in your country, we always welcome you to go to our members list as well and look at our members and maybe support our members. I mean, we are of course always very happy also if our members get more support, because they are really responsible for the national and local work.
Simone, thank you so much for speaking with Great.com today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, and good luck with your program. It was really a pleasure.
Thank you. And hey, if you are listening to this, consider subscribing to our podcast. And if you do it on your podcast app, that will really help us out to spread these conversations to even more people. Thank you. And we see you in the next episode.